Good afternoon. Today we'll be working on our sheet titled Grade 7 World Geography, Africa Unit AF4, History of Africa, 19th Century Colonization Notes. As I go through the notes, your responsibility as a student are to fill in the blanks to make sure that you have all the necessary information. At the end, we will go over it as a class, and you'll have the opportunity to fill in anything that you may have missed. We will now start with the main idea. And the first main idea states that in the 19th century, many European nations developed into world powers. In the 1800s, Britain had the strongest military in the world. They were considered the U.S. of today. So Britain then was the U.S. of today. Number two in size at this point was really France. France was the second strongest nation in the world. Throughout the 1800s or the 19th century, Europe continues to come together and become more powerful. In 1848, the country of Italy unifies and becomes its own full country. Up to this point, it's made up of a series of kingdoms. And those kingdoms had names like Florence and Bologna and Rome and all cities today, but they were considered independent kingdoms. When you get to 1848, those kingdoms cease to exist. Italy unifies into one country. Another example of this is Germany. They unify in 1871, and they become a country as well. Again, they have many Germanic kingdoms. When these countries unify, what they do is they unify according to ethnicity. This is the factor that holds them together. This is the factor that makes them come and want to stay together. The Italians stay together to make Italy. The Germans stand together to make Germany. In 1919, the Irish come together to make Ireland, etc., 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 across the continent of Europe. As these world powers develop, we enter a period in history known as the Three Isms. And this is where we move on to our second main idea. And the first main idea, the first part of this second main idea, rather, is the idea of nationalism. All of these new countries that are unified by their ethnicity have a strong nationalistic identity. And nationalism is defined as extreme pride in one's nation. This is not just I'm proud to be French. This is I am proud to be French. The French are the best people in the world. If you are not French, you are the swine of the world, and you do not even have the right to come near a Frenchman. This does spread across Europe, and it leads to quite a competitive atmosphere. Very competitive. Now, if you're a politician in Europe, or a king or a queen, your success will be determined by the success of the nationalistic pride your people have. And the best way to ensure that nationalistic pride is through militarism, which is the second ism. And when you engage in militarism, your goal is to build the strongest army possible. And you spend all of your excess money, probably even more than excess money, on troops, on training, on, at this point, horses, swords, bayonets, rifles, anything you can get that's military driven, you're getting, and you're spending a ton of money on it. Money's no object. And everybody in the country supports you because they all have a sense of nationalism. If I went into a class of students in Europe at this point in time, asked who's going to join the military, every boy, they were sexist at that point in time, every boy in the class would raise their hand and say, yes, I would. So now that you have this nationalistic pride and you have this massive amassing military across Europe, you've got Britain building a huge military, Germany building a huge military, France building a whole military, Spain trying to rebuild their military, all these places building it, you've got to do something with it. And this leads to the third ism, which is imperialism. Imperialism. And imperialism does require a little bit more explanation as we go forward. Imperialism is the conquering of lands to prove the strength of one's military. So you're doing this to show off military strength. How strong is one's military? Okay? And you did this by going around and building an empire. This term imperial really leads to the idea of empires. So you conquer lands around the globe, amassing as many colonies as possible, mostly in Asia and Africa. So why are these colonies, do they become so important? One, the colonies become very, very important for resources and trade. By having a colony, you can take their resources at a very favorable cost, and you can also have exclusive trade with the colonists there, which will also help build your economy. Imperialism, or the age of empires, also results in a mentality. And that mentality across Europe is that bigger is better. The bigger your country, the better you were, the better off you were. And in fact, Britain was so powerful at the height of their empire that it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. Why? Because they effectively had colonies in every time zone around the world by about 1900. The people and the leaders of Europe recognized, moving into our third main idea, that there was room for conflict now between European nations. So they meet in 1884 at the Berlin Conference. And the goal here was to prevent conflict between European countries in Africa. They did not want a Europe versus Europe battle in Africa or in Asia over possible territories. They wanted to avoid this. Why did they want to avoid it? Because if Britain fights France, somebody is going to lose. And let's say the French lose. Well, now their nationalistic pride is devastated. Their militarism and the money they spent on that was a waste. And every politician in France is now in trouble. What they wanted was a European country versus an African tribe. Something like the Zulu. Why? Because when it's Europe versus African tribes, it's a guaranteed win. They had a guaranteed win versus African tribes, not against European armies. So they meet in 1884 at Berlin to basically divide up the map of Africa. They do not invite any Africans. No one from Africa is at the conference. But while they're at the conference, what they do is they take the map of Africa, and I know my art's not the best, and they literally divide it up into territories, and they start saying France gets this, Britain gets this, Germany gets this, Portugal gets this. And by the time you're done, the entire map of Africa, for the most part, is controlled by some European country. This leads to the rapid colonization of Africa. Colonies are going up everywhere incredibly quickly. Some examples of this, Britain, for example, gets South Africa, what we now call South Africa. Italy gets what we now call Ethiopia. France gets what we now call Algeria. And you could keep going for the whole map, but it's completely divided up against the European powers. Well, the European powers, moving to our final main idea, do have to go in and actually conquer the people who are there. But it's an unfair fight. The European nations dominated the local tribes and communities. The clashes were very unbalanced. The indigenous people had no idea what was coming. One day, a tank and a whole bunch of soldiers would come into the village. And when they did fight, it was going to be machine guns versus bows and arrows. It's not a fair fight. In my opinion, the machine gun is one of the darkest inventions or the worst inventions in history, in my opinion, because when they went in here, it was just utter devastation because of the amount of people and the amount of bullets a machine gun could hold, especially when the other side is armed with much more primitive weaponry. It was first used in the American Civil War, but it didn't work very well then. It overheated, and it really did not become a key weapon until these conflicts in Africa. To give you an idea of how unfair the fight was, in the late 1800s, there was a conflict called the Boer War, which was between the British and a group of actually longtime settlers in Africa known as the Boer. And in over the course of this conflict, 5,000 British troops lost their lives. But again, it was machine guns versus bows and arrows. So for the 5,000 Brits, 66,000 Boers lost their lives. And unfortunately, this is a pretty distressing kill count. And obviously, as you know, the British do maintain control of the colony of South Africa. Again, to kind of end where we are, to rehash that map that I drew before, just so you understand. With a few exceptions, by the time we get to 1900, the map of Africa is divided amongst Europe, and the African people have virtually no say about anything that goes on in their continent. As you review the notes, make sure that you have all the information that you need. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask. And remember, you can always rewatch this video to enhance your learning experience.